This is the Marcus Miller V7, and people have been talking about this bass a lot in recent years. There's a lot of reviews already online of this bass, and they all say pretty much the same thing, that it's a really, really good bass at a surprisingly cheap price. And it's hard for me to disagree with that, so I'm not going to do a full review of the bass. There's no point. I'd just be telling you exactly the same thing that everyone says. It's made out of really good materials. You know, it's easy to play. They set it up with a nice low action. It has a really good preamp on it, which you can turn on and off. And I'm not sure it even needs the preamp, to be honest, because it sounds really good when you play it with the preamp switched off. But it's a bonus having it there, I suppose, for when you're playing through a DI box or something like that. So it's a really, really good bass. It's much cheaper than you'd expect it to be. So I had one question that I wanted to answer, which is, should you get the 4-string version or should you get the 5-string version? I have the 4-string version on the wall behind me, and I have the 5-string version here. Now, they're both basically identical models. They both have the Alder body. You can get them in Alder or Swamp Ash. And this is the Alder body, and it's the 2nd generation V7 bass. So they should sound fairly identical. The only thing is, I've discovered with the 5-string, I get a slightly hotter signal on the 5-string. It's slightly louder when I've been recording it, so I've had to bring the levels down slightly when I've been recording the 5-string versus the 4-string. Not particularly sure why that should be. Maybe the strings are set up a little bit closer to the pickups. Maybe the pickups have a slightly higher output on the 5-string version. The strings certainly sound a little bit newer on my 5-string than my 4-string. I did toy with the idea of putting brand new strings on both basses, but I didn't want to do that because I wanted to present them the way that they came out the box, because they both came out the box sounding really great. Anyway, I was getting a slightly hotter signal on the 5-string for some reason, but they're basically identical and they sound pretty close to identical to each other. So, when you're deciding whether you want to get the 4-string or the 5-string version, it basically comes down to, do you want to get that extra range that the low B string gives you? And it's very difficult to get a low B string right on a bass, I think, because the low B, it's such a low note that the string is under less tension than the other 4 strings. So it's very common on 5 and 6 string basses that the low B string sounds a bit weak in comparison to the other 4 strings. And when that happens, it makes it a bit pointless, really, because then you don't want to play the low B string, and if you don't want to play it, there's no point in it being there. So the question here is that low B string on the V7 good enough to make it worth buying the 5-string rather than the 4-string? So I was trying to think of a way to do a kind of fair comparison here between the 5-string and the 4-string. And the thing is that Marcus Miller, I don't think I've ever seen him play a 5-string bass. He plays 4-string basses. So the 4-string version is very, very similar to what Marcus Miller plays. Now, when Marcus Miller wants that extra range in a low direction, what he does is he tunes his E string down to a D. So what I thought I'd do is I'd play the same bass groove on the 4-string tuned down to a D and on the 5-string in standard tuning. Have a listen. So I have to say this is a good 5-string bass. That low B string really does sit quite well in the mix with the other 4 strings, especially when I play fingerstyle for some reason. That doesn't sound weak at all to me. Maybe when I play kind of Marcus Miller thumb and pluck style, it sounds a little bit less convincing, maybe. So here's the E string and the B string. Yeah, I'm not sure that it sounds quite as good when you're playing that style, but still, that's a really, it's a small detail, and this is an excellent 5-string bass for the price. So I definitely wouldn't want to put anyone put anyone off getting one. But having said that, my preference is definitely for the 4-string bass. And I think the biggest deciding factor for me is the string spacing, because on the 5-string, the string spacing is slightly narrower than on the 4-string. And that's a really common thing, but I'm just not a fan of those 5-string basses. I like my 5-string basses to have the same width, it's 20 millimeters is the standard string spacing on a 4-string bass, and I would like that on my 5-string as well. And when it doesn't have it, like this one, it just slightly off-putting, and I'm just not a fan of it. So for that reason, if I was going to buy just one Marcus Miller bass, I would buy the V7 4-string, and it just feels like a Marcus Miller bass, because Marcus plays 4-string basses, and that just feels like you're playing one of his basses, and it sounds like it, and I just really enjoy playing it. I really like the 5-string, but when I'm playing it, I find myself wanting to put it down and pick up the 4-string. So to be honest, I'm struggling to think of many negative things to say about these basses, or any really. I had to do slight setup adjustments on both of them. So there was a string rattling on the 4-string, which was caused by one of the saddles being it wasn't set right, it was at an angle, but that was really easy to change. Just had to do an Allen key adjustment on one of the screws. It took me about 10 seconds to fix. On the 5-string, I slightly raised the height of the low B string. It was the action was a bit too low just on that one string, and the string wasn't vibrating properly. But again, those are really small details, and to be honest, I don't see that as a problem, because the price of the bass is such that you don't expect them to be set up perfectly. If you're paying thousands of pounds for a bass, then you expect it to be set up really well. With a bass that only costs a few £100, then you expect to do a little bit of stuff like that. If it comes set up perfectly, then great, but you just consider yourself lucky. And little adjustments like that are just part and parcel of when you buy a bass at this price range. But it's a really, really good bass, and whether you get the 4-string or the 5-string, they're both really good basses. My preference would be for the 4-string.